How has Randall Kennedy's thinking about race and the law evolved over the past 20 years? He'll join us to talk about his new collection of essays, Say It Loud, on race, law, history, and culture. Speaking of law, can animals break the law? Mary Roach will be here to talk about her new book, Fuzz. Liz Harris will be here to talk about what's going on in the publishing world. Plus, our critics will join us to talk about the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's September 24th. I'm Pamela Paul. Randall Kennedy joins us now from Dedham, Massachusetts. His newest book is called Say It Loud, on race, law, history, and culture. Randall, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Tell us about the origins of this book, which is a collection of 29 essays.
Well, over the years, I've written lots of essays for magazines and newspapers. I like writing essays. I like writing book reviews. And so I decided under the COVID cloud to collect them and to revise them, update them. And that's what I did.
So this was your pandemic project?
This was a pandemic project, yes.
And presumably a lot of this writing is very different from the kind of writing and work that you do as a professor at Harvard Law School.
Yes and no. These essays are for a general audience, so they're not technical. But in another sort of way, they are like the stuff that I do that's more technical. One of the best pieces of advice that I've received with respect to writing was from a magazine editor who said the following to me. He said, when you write stuff in academia, you've got a captive audience. If you're the teacher, the students have to read it. If you are the professor, you're writing for your peers, your peers have to read it. But if you're writing for a general interest newspaper or magazine, nobody has to read what you're writing. You have to draw the reader in from that very first sentence, that very first title. And I took that to heart. I thought that was really good advice, and I've used that. And so frankly, when I do my writing, I imagine a smart, demanding audience, and I imagine that audience for practically all that I do.
Well, let's stay with the subject of academia for a moment, because you cover that in various ways in a number of the essays in this collection. And I want to start with one specifically, which is called The Princeton Ultimatum, Anti-Racism Gone Awry, which originally ran in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And this essay was written in response to an ultimatum issued to the president of Princeton in July of 2020. What did that ultimatum say, and why did you want to respond to it?
The ultimatum had two parts to it. One, it was an indictment of Princeton University, saying that Princeton University continues to be essentially a racist institution. And then the second part of the letter was a long set of demands on the university, including a demand that the university set up some sort of committee that would oversee professorial research, teaching, make sure that it wasn't racist, and if it was racist, to take some sort of disciplinary action toward it. That was the open letter. Why did I want to respond? I wanted to respond because part of it was personal. I went to Princeton University. I was on the board of trustees of Princeton University 2 times, and part of the criticism of the university involved policies of the university, conditions at the university, while I was a trustee. And so I asked myself, well, was I complicit in systemic racism at Princeton University? And I came to the conclusion that no, I was not, and that no, the university is not, and that this was a misportrayal of Princeton University in its recent history. And I thought this was a very serious accusation. It should be taken seriously. And so I tried to take it seriously and responded accordingly.
The letter itself was written by a combination of grad students, lecturers, but also professors, including a number of names that'll be familiar to our readers, many of them contributors to the book review at one point or another. Tracy K. Smith, Eddie Glaude, Jhumpa Lahiri, Michael Wood, Paul Muldoon, Nell Irvin Painter. I guess, first of all, this was a summer for this kind of letter. And so it wasn't totally unusual that this happened. Was the number of people and the kinds of people who wrote this letter considered significant enough that it warranted an immediate response? And how did the university respond?
Frankly, I don't know all about the university's response. I read the letter. It was signed, that's right, by at least 350 professors at a major institution. And again, one has to be attentive to the allegation that was being made. The allegation that was being made, I mean, there were a wide set of allegations, but one allegation was that Princeton University was engaged in racial discrimination in a variety of ways on a institution-wide basis. Well, that is a heck of a serious condemnation. And if it was true, it should provoke a response across the country. I mean, that's a major thing if it was accurate. My sense is that it was inaccurate, and therefore, because the accusation is so important, it warranted a careful response. That's why I wrote what I wrote.
And several of the demands that the letter made, you described as flagrantly problematic. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those demands are? Because those kinds of demands are not just happening at Princeton, of course, but at other Ivy League universities, at many other colleges and arts organizations across the country.
The most important one, the most troubling one, the most disturbing one was this demand about instituting some sort of committee to review professorial work. Now, that, it seemed to me, was a flagrant encroachment on academic freedom if it were to be instituted. And frankly, I thought that once this demand was highlighted, I thought that people would say, well, actually, I signed on in the spirit of the letter, but I want to distance myself from that particular demand. That's not what happened, actually. I didn't hear much abandonment of that demand. And furthermore, there were a number of people who actually doubled down and tried to justify it. Again, I found that very troubling. There were other things. I mean, there were a couple of places where the demand essentially was that the university, in terms of employment, in terms of promotion, treat racial minority academics differently than other academics. I'm sure that the general counsel of the university would have had something to say about that, since it was probably unlawful what they were talking about, and apart from being unlawful, was, in my view, unwise. So those are some of the things that were on my mind when I wrote that.
Have these kinds of demands come to Harvard, where you currently teach at the law school?
At the law school, not so much. But you were right when you said that the spirit behind the letter at Princeton is a spirit that one sees at many institutions. And don't get me wrong, I applaud much of the spirit, because what's behind the demands is an impatience with a society that is still scarred by all sorts of injustices, racism, sexism, other sorts of, terrible prejudices. And the people who were writing these letters and signing on to these letters and engaging in other dissident activity, they wanted to put an end to this. Me too. But I think that in addressing these issues, one needs to be careful. That's all. One needs to be careful. One does not want to discredit oneself by making claims that are untenable.
All right, let's talk about something else totally uncontroversial. Not at all, actually. Critical race theory, another topic that actually arose directly out of not just of academia, but out of legal scholarship. When we talk about what's now referred to as CRT, the debate is obviously incredibly polarized and distorted. But you know of which you speak, and you've been a long time critic in many respects of critical race theory, although probably not, I imagine, for many of the reasons people are talking about it today in the popular media. Can you talk about what you see as the pros and cons of critical race theory and where your thinking of it stands today? And maybe we should quickly even define it just because it has been so distorted in the media.
Well, on the question of definition, that's a complicated one. When people use the term critical race theory, certainly when it's used by the people behind this campaign to essentially banish it, it's a boogeyman. It's a term that people have used to further their own ideological ends. So as far as I'm concerned, when the term critical race theory is used nowadays, it should be, you should put quotation marks around it. Like I say, the people who want to banish it have created their own version of it to make it an easy target for suppression. Critical race theory really started at Harvard Law School as part of a effort to push and to criticize liberal legalism. The two basic ideas, the two main themes animating critical race theory are, as far as I'm concerned, completely unobjectionable. In fact, they're good ideas. One idea is the idea that racism has been absolutely central in American political culture, American legal culture. In every aspect of American history, in every aspect of American life, one can see racism from the most private spheres, if we're talking about sex, if we're talking about marriage, if we're talking about friendship, to the most public spheres, jury service, voting. One sees the race line everywhere. Okay, it seems to me that that's absolutely true. The second big theme of critical race theory was the idea that conventional anti-discrimination law, the law that was the inheritance of the Second Reconstruction, Brown versus Board of Education, Loving versus Virginia, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The critical race theory folks said, that's good stuff, but it's insufficient. It is clearly insufficient. It has been unable to change adequately the racial hierarchy in American society. Now, frankly, I think, both of those ideas are good ideas. So where's the criticism? Well, one criticism that I think is particularly pertinent for the present moment is that there were some people in critical race theory. And by the way, critical race theory is not monolithic. There are debates within critical race theory. It's not like everybody who calls themselves a critical race theorist believes the same thing. But there were some people in critical race theory, for instance, who took the position that liberal ideas defending freedom of speech were counterproductive and basically aided illicit racial hierarchy.
What does that mean exactly in practice?
What that means in practice is that racist speech ought not be tolerated. That's what it meant, just bluntly, racist speech ought not be tolerated. So if you have a speaker on campus or that's coming to campus and you determine that that person's message is racist, it's okay to exclude it. It's okay to shout it down. Now, the reason why I say this is quite pertinent is because right now, people like Donald Trump are saying that critical race theory is racist. And therefore, it's perfectly fine to banish it. Well, if you're going to take the position that you can banish racist speech, And of course, the whole idea of, what is racist speech? Very amorphous. It all depends who's telling the story. Well, if you're going to run things like that, then the people who are dissidents and who are saying things that are quite good, they are vulnerable to this illiberal view towards expression.
Sort of unintended consequences.
Very much unintended. There were other things about critical race theory, and here I'll mention my colleague of blessed memory, Derek Bell. Derek Bell and some proponents of critical race theory have taken the position that racism, yes, racism is deep, and it's so deep, it's so burdensome, it's so powerful that it has prevented any change, any appreciable change in American life insofar as the race line is concerned. Well, what are you talking about? How did Barack Obama become president of the United States for 8 years? Now, I'm not saying that the ascension of Barack Obama brought heaven on earth. I'm not saying that, that was the end of racism in American life. Far from it, obviously not. But it did signal, for goodness sakes, change in American life. Right now, the vice president of the United States is a black American. When I was born in 1954, the idea of a black American president or vice president, it would have been hard to have put your mind around it. So there has been change, and to say that there has not been any change, again, it seems to me that that's just self-discrediting. You don't have to say that in order to make the point that we are still in a perilous situation and that there is still much work to be done. So those are some of the things that prompted me to be critical of critical race theory, though I want to make it very clear, I want no part of the attack on critical race theory that has been lodged over the past few months. I'm totally against that. And whatever you think of critical race theory, you should be against the effort to banish it from our educational institutions.
Do you think it's become increasingly difficult to hold the kinds of nuanced criticisms and views that you're talking about on a complicated subject in an era in which issues like critical race theory, issues like systemic racism have become so polarized and distorted in the public discourse?
I think it's always been difficult to have conversations about volatile topics where there's a lot of nuance. People have internal tensions, drawing lines, making fine distinctions. That's always been difficult. Is it more difficult now? Maybe it's probably more difficult now because the temperature around these discussions is so high, tensions are so high. So it's probably more difficult now, to some extent, but it's always been difficult. Listen, a number of years ago, very early on, I wrote a piece about what's now termed critical race theory. And when I wrote that article, it was in 1989, I sent it to my colleague, Derek Bell, and he wrote me a letter in which he urged me not to publish the article. And he said, don't publish this article because your article will be used against us. And so he said, please don't publish it. Well, I published it, and he was very angry about it. And there were other people who were very angry about it. In fact, I'm sure there are colleagues of mine in legal academia who have never forgiven me for that 1989 article I wrote, Racial Critiques of Legal Academia. It was an article that acknowledged certain strengths in the thinking that I was criticizing, but it also noticed certain weaknesses. And people just didn't want to hear that. It was all or nothing. You're with us or you're against us. Is it like that now to some extent? Or maybe even to a greater extent? Yeah, probably so.
Speaking of with us or against us, you had written in a number of places earlier, and I'm going to paraphrase, that you thought there would never be another major politician in American life who would traffic in openly racial resentment, racial division, racism, that you thought we'd turn the page on that. In what ways did the Trump presidency change your perception of the state of racism in this country and race in politics?
Changed it considerably. And here, by the way, I want to just say straight out, I was wrong. I was wrong. And I want to also say that the thinking, or at least a large part of the thinking of Derek Bell and some of the critical race theory people, they were really on to something. The critical race theorists, some of their writing would have better prepared the public for the ascension of Donald Trump than some of my writing. That's number one. Number two, how has it changed my view? Well, clearly, I thought that the United States was much further down the road to racial decency than it is. I mean, Donald Trump obviously trafficked in racial resentment, racial prejudice in a way that I thought was securely locked in the past. And this has had a big influence on me. I used to be a quite confident racial optimist. I am not any longer. I think I'm still in the optimistic camp. I do think that we shall overcome, but I'm uneasy. I'm uneasy in a way that was, simply not the case, let's say 10 years ago.
Let's talk about what may be one of the causes for pessimism in addition to the Trump presidency and post-Trump political atmosphere, and that is voting rights. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on where things stand with voting rights with regard to the 2013 Supreme Court decision, Shelby County versus Holder, and all of the things that are going on right now in an effort on the state level in particular to roll back voting rights.
Yeah, well, this is one of the reasons why I'm filled with trepidation. Number one, you have the Supreme Court of the United States eviscerating the most effective single legislative act of the Second Reconstruction. That the case to which you alluded was one of the great judicial delinquencies in the history of the Supreme Court of the United States. That's our Supreme Court. We're not talking about the Supreme Court of the 1890s. We're talking about our Supreme Court. And that decision was an unjustifiable decision, an absolutely terrible decision. And, we're living with the consequences. In the aftermath of that decision, we see at every level of government increasingly aggressive attacks on the right to vote. And it's obvious what's going on here. It's obvious that the people who are attacking voting rights are trying to trying to diminish as much as they can the electoral power of people who they consider to be their political adversaries, their political enemies. That's what's going on. Who knows what the ultimate upshot is? I fear that we are in a season of stalemate. I fear that the forces of reform are going to fall short and are not going to be able to effectuate reform. That's my great fear.
You've been very critical in the past of, and in some of these essays, of specific Supreme Court justices, Anthony Kennedy, Clarence Thomas, John Roberts. What is your take on the current makeup of the Supreme Court and with regard to voting rights, but also other issues of importance? Are you worried about the direction of the current Supreme Court?
Oh, absolutely. I think that our Supreme Court is a court that shows little sympathy for the marginalized, for the oppressed. It's a court that is clearly unsympathetic to organized labor. It's a court that is very sympathetic to business corporations. We have a court that is a great friend of those on top, a great friend of the haves, and it is an enemy of those on the bottom, those who are marginalized. I fear our present Supreme Court. I fear it, and frankly, I don't respect it very much. You mentioned a number of the justices. There are two essays in this collection that particularly target Justice Thomas, who is the most reactionary member of a reactionary court. And so, like I said, I'm very fearful of our present Supreme Court. And I hope that people will understand what's going on. The Chief Justice wants to have people believe that our courts are above politics. But it's not just the Chief Justice. I mean, Stephen Breyer recently published a book in which he talks about the perils of politics, and he portrays the court as being apart from and above politics. Absolutely ludicrous. It's absolutely ridiculous. Of course, the Supreme Court is a power wielding instrument of governmental authority. It is thoroughly political. And frankly, how could it not be?
One other question on the law, very different part now, law enforcement. What is your take on the current movement to abolish the police and the fact that this is referred to as an abolition movement? And then, two-part question. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as the double-sidedness of our thinking on the police?
Point one, it's scandalous that our legal system does such a poor job of regulating the police. Your regular police officer walking down the street is carrying death dealing weapons. They should be regulated, and they should be regulated carefully. If you buy a refrigerator, you're likely to get a call later, and the call will say, how did the person with whom you dealt, was the person courteous? And did the person give you satisfaction? Does that ever happen with the police? No, the legal system does not take seriously the problem of police misconduct, police racism, and this is a scandal. Point one. Point two, we need effective, good policing because another problem is the problem of criminality. People do rob other people. People do rape other people. People do murder other people. So criminality is a big problem, and we need to have good, effective policing to address, or at least that's a partially addressing that problem. When bad people do bad things, we need them apprehended and we need them punished. So, to get to your question about abolishing the police, no, I'm totally against the idea of abolishing the police because we need the police. And in fact, people in poor communities really need the police. Affluent people can purchase police protection. They can go behind, they can be in gated communities, they can hire their own police forces. It's, just regular folks and poor folks who are in need of this essential public service policing. Now, it needs to be good policing, but do we need good policing? Absolutely. So, no, I'm against the idea of abolishing the police.
What's the double-sidedness? I mean, is that because there's under-policing as well, right?
Absolutely. So if one thinks about, let's say, Black people and the administration of criminal justice, Black people in America have been menaced on two fronts. On the one hand, they have been subject to racial prejudice through surveillance, through prejudice with respect to being overly punished. They have been subjected to miscarriages of justice where innocent people have not been accorded their rights. all of this. So, the black person as suspect, the black person as defendant, the black person who's convicted and then overpunished. That is a big part of the story. But there is another part of the story that's very important as well, and that is under protection of the law. What do I mean by under protection? Well, think of lynchings. What was that? That was criminality. That was black people being subjected to vigilante justice, and they were being underprotected. Very important part of American legal history. And more recently, if you have a situation in which you have communities that are being menaced by criminality, where you have people who are scared to walk to the grocery store because of gangs and what have you, thuggery, what have you. That's a problem. Those are people who are being underserved. They are not being accorded the equal protection of the law. And that has been and is a big problem. So we have to think about both of those things at the same time. Of course, we want the police to be limited. We want prosecutors to be limited. We want government to stay within proper bounds. At the same time, we want these government agencies to protect people and protect communities. Both fronts have to be considered at the same time, and we have to be attentive to both at the same time.
There's so much more in this collection that I want to ask you about, and we don't have time, but I want to ask you one last question because you said something earlier that is a rare phrase heard today, which is, I was wrong. And I'm curious, when you were putting together this collection, this anthology, you said you've updated and you changed certain things. Were there points where you looked and you said, oh, I was wrong on that, where you corrected it? Did you always change it or update it? Or did you sometimes say, well, that's what my thinking was then, and I'll let it stand as a kind of record of where I was? How did you handle that?
I was very attentive to places where I thought that I was wrong, and I made a point of saying so. And there's no shame in that. Hopefully, you live and learn. You read more, you talk with people more, and you change your mind. So there are a bunch of places in this collection where I confess error and I just, I say, I believe this then, but I've switched. So in my essay on Derek Bell, I do that. I say, you know what? I've changed my mind. He was right. I was wrong. I do that in other places. There's an essay about a man by the name of Philip Ellman. He was a lawyer, government lawyer. He worked in the Solicitor General's office. And I wrote a very harsh critique of him years ago. And I got that essay from years ago. I looked at it, I thought about it, and I thought that I was overly critical of him. And I said so. I'm sorry that went at him in the way that I did. I basically called him racist. And I said, you know what? No, that was overdoing it. I think he was wrong. But actually, I think the way in which I pitched my attack was itself wrong. So, I don't mind that at all.
Much to think about here in this book, which covers a huge amount of territory. The book, again, is Say It Loud: On Race, Law, History, and Culture by Randall Kennedy. Randall, thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you. I have enjoyed our talk.
Tina Jordan joins us now to help celebrate the 125th anniversary of the book review. Hey, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. So, for me, one of the pleasures of paging through the archives is finding wonderfully written reviews that just stay with me. And I want to read to you what I think is the best lead of a review that we ever ran, and one that I'm quite certain I'll never get out of my head. It's from 1969. And it's our review of The Godfather by Mario Puzo. And it was written by a sports journalist named Dick Schaap. So I'm just going to read you the lead. It's a little bit long for a lead by today's standards, but I think you'll like it too. There are strong similarities between Michael Corleone and Alexander Portnoy. Neither of them, for instance, wishes to enter his father's line of work. Each of them falls for an Anglo-Saxon Protestant girl. Of course, there are some differences too. When Alexander Portnoy's father is frustrated, he gets constipated. When Michael Corleone's father is frustrated, he gets someone killed. If Philip Roth has created a Jewish mother who can actually give you heartburn, Mario Puzo has created a Sicilian father who will make you shiver every time you stroll down Mulberry Street. And with loving care and detail, what Roth has done for masturbation, Puzo has done for murder.
Prescient review.
Come on, you liked that, right?
I like that. There's so many great leads in the book review, I have to say, over the years that I don't know if it would be my number one, but I think that it's definitely top 10.
It's up there.
All right. Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, Pamela.
Mary Roach joins us now from Oakland, California. She is the author of many books, including Stiff, Gulp, Bonk, Spook, and now Fuzz, When Nature Breaks the Law. Mary, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
All right, so I ran through all of those things. We can tell what some of them are about, but I'm curious how you come up with your subject matters. They all are quite different from one another.
Yeah, and I never really have the tidy origin story. Well, sometimes I do, but in this case, not. This was a protracted period of kind of grasping and flailing and basically trying to find a book idea with no idea which way I was going to go. I never have a list of ideas ready and waiting to jump into, sadly. I'd love to be that person. In this case, I had gotten interested in wildlife forensics, this being situations where the animals are the victims, not the perpetrator. So I was up at the National Wildlife Forensics Laboratory with this woman who has the largest hair library. She has a hair library by species.
That's scaring me. Okay, it's not human hair. Okay, no. I don't know. Animal hair feels a little bit better somehow.
Yeah, it's like, and it's incredibly complicated because animals don't just have a couple kinds of hair. They have guard hairs and they have the fluff underneath the hair and they have the whiskers. And so she's like this savant at identifying hair fragments. It's very CSI Animal Kingdom. That was kind of interesting, but I wanted to tag along with investigators and I wanted to do the thing that I do, which is to go and be a pest and see how people do what they do and have scenes and conversations. And the head of the lab said, legally, no, you can't do this. You can't tag along on an open case. Sorry. So back to the drawing board, kind of had this idea to turn things around. What about wildlife as the perpetrators and people as the victims? And then stumbled onto that weird 1906 book, The Criminal Prosecution and Capital Punishment of Animals, which is this bizarre look at what used to be done centuries ago, where animals would be summoned into court, including insects. Yeah. And held in prison and sometimes hung in the public square if they attacked or harmed someone. The legal system, not the way to go about it, really, with animal conflict. So
wait, describe a case like that. I mean, what kind of animals were dragged into court and hung publicly?
Okay, well, yeah, pigs sometimes, and that's a weird one because a pig is is owned by somebody, so legally it should fall in the category of property, and the owner of the property should be liable. So that was a whole weird scene. But wild animals, including insects, the case that I talked about in Fuzz was 1659 in a province of northern Italy. Caterpillars are ravaging the fields, the crops, as they do. They're caterpillars. They eat leaves. So the town fathers posted summons on trees near the plots of food that were growing, telling the caterpillars to appear in court on a set day and informing them that they would be assigned legal representation. Caterpillars. And obviously, the caterpillars did not show up in court on the appointed day, but there was a legal proceeding, and the outcome was a decision to set aside some other land for the caterpillars so that they would leave alone the crops of the people. And of course, by that point, the caterpillars had pupated and had stopped eating the crops. So everybody felt like, oh, well, that was a nice resolution.
It was settled out of court.
It was settled out of court. Exactly. I started thinking, what we could do jaywalking, we could do trespassing, we could do vandalism, we could do murder and manslaughter, home invasion, because animals do all these things. Obviously, they can't read the law. You don't give them tickets or fines. But they do all this stuff, and what do? We turn to science.
Didn't a dried tiger penis somehow figure into the process of your settling on this subject?
It did, yes, it did. The lady with the hair library, she's the author of a paper and a guidebook on how to distinguish real versus fake tiger penis, which turns out to be really easy. The reason you would need to know this is because these penises are sold as a quote-unquote medicinal material for boosting virility. In some Asian countries, they're made into a soup. And so when these cross borders and things and they're confiscated, she's brought in to say, well, whose penis really is this? And in fact, the tiger has a very surprisingly, for a tiger, small penis. I have some photographs on my phone. I can show you.
And what do the fake dry tiger penises look like?
Those are usually horse, cow, a much bigger penis, partly because it's easier to get those, but also they're more, shall we say, inspirational. You know, if you're looking for an erectile dysfunction aid, they're more inspiring. You have to doctor them up a bit because cats have little barbs on their penis and the cows and horses don't. And I was envisioning this little sweatshop where people were carving the little barbs into the dried penis to make it look like a cat penis. That was another thing I was excited about doing for the book that I didn't write. But anyway.
When we think about breaking the law, animals breaking the law, the thing that jumps to mind, at least to my mind, is like breaking and entering, right? Because that animals do that. They will break into houses, raccoons, sometimes squirrels, bears. But I imagine you're talking about breaking the law on a much broader canvas. What are some of the ways in which animals can break the law?
Well, that is one of them, breaking and entering. That's one of them. Well, I talk about manslaughter, attacks. And in particular, I was interested in the forensics of when somebody's killed and the body is found. And you have to figure out not just who did it, which is what you would do in a human-on-human killing, but first you have to start with what species. So you look at the telltale marks on the body, the tooth marks and the claw marks, and where was the person attacked, all of that to figure out, was it a bear? Was it a mountain lion? Was it a wolf? Was it possibly a human? Because sometimes humans have been accused of crimes that were committed by animals and vice versa.
Do humans ever try to set animals up as the perpetrator?
No, but there was a case. I don't think it was an intentional setup. I think the guy just lucked out. But there was a man murdered somebody on a hiking trail using an ice pick to the neck. So there were these stab wounds to the neck. And a cougar or mountain lion, depending on where you live, kills in a very specific way. It jumps on from behind and does this killing bite to the back of the neck to sever the spinal cord and kill its prey. So it made some sense that they thought, okay, wound to the neck, but there wasn't the jaw and the lower jaw. You should have, if there's a set of puncture marks representing the top teeth, there should be a corresponding lower jaw. There wasn't that. And also they should have been able to find, these cats have sort of triangular claws. They sink them in to hold the victim. There was none of that. It was just these three very round puncture marks. Anyway, so it was ruled a mountain lion killing, and the actual killer went free until about a decade later. He was serving time for something else, and he bragged to someone in the prison about what he had gotten away with that ice pick killing, and was finally brought to justice.
Did the cougar get off?
Yeah, I don't know if they apprehended the cougar or not. I don't know. But it's interesting. They'll hold if they'll trap. There's been a killing, and they'll set it like a big culvert trap. And if they catch a bear, they do a DNA analysis. They'll look at from the blood or the saliva on the victim and match it with the animal. And if it's not a match, the suspect is released, or it should be.
Aren't we human beings, though, for the most part, on animals' turf, and increasingly so?
Yeah, if you go back far enough, yeah, we everywhere we are, they were there first. So yeah, it does seem a little unfair that they always get the short end of the stick.
Let's talk about some maybe more minor infractions. Who is the moose who jaywalks?
Okay, so moose, like anyone else, they cross the road to get to the other side. They are after food, or they're looking for mates. There are various reasons for crossing the road, and they don't look both ways always, and at night it's particularly hazardous. I talk about moose. Is the plural moose or mooses? Let's say mooses. I don't know.
Neither sounds right now.
No, neither sounds right. We could do elk or camels. Anyway, any tall, really long-legged ungulate is very dangerous, actually, to the driver, because what happens if you hit one of these animals, the front of the car is hitting the legs rather than the torso, so the legs are knocked out from under, and the torso and the head pinwheel back, and the animals are so tall that they come crashing through the windshield and part of the roof. And a lot of times the person's neck is broken, so it's often they end up paralyzed. So it's a very treacherous scenario. So there's various technologies that people are looking at to try to make it easier for the animal to realize what's happening. Because at night, if you look at a car coming at you, you see 2 points of light, the headlights. And because it's dark, you're not seeing the whole vehicle. So you don't have that, normally when something's coming at you, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And your eyes process that as this thing is coming towards me and it's coming fast. And with just headlights, you don't have that. So the deer in the headlights problem is they're looking at it going, pinpricks of light, those are weird. What are they? Boom. They're not processing that it's coming towards them. So there's technologies to kind of light up the grill of the car so that they can perceive it as a vehicle that is approaching at high speed. But anyway, moose are a big problem up north. Saab and Volvo actually have a moose crash test dummy that they developed to try to make the car safer.
To moose-proof them.
Yeah, they're trying to moose-proof the cars. That's exactly right.
We can't not talk about bears, especially because bears are your cover animal here on the book. But also when I think about proofing things, you think about bear-proofing garbage cans. Tell us about bears and how they break the law, maybe in unexpected ways.
In places where there are a lot of bears, I was in Pitkin County, Colorado, where there are a couple of ski resorts. So there, here, talk about going into their terrain. We are going in and building these lovely, huge houses up in the hills. And you look around. I went to the scene of one break-in up in the hills, and all the plants growing around. There were, crabapple and chokecherry and serviceberry and acorn. They're all foods that bears love to eat. So you put a house in the middle of that where there's lots of bears. Now the bears are going to start looking around at the human habitation and go, inside that big box, there's a smaller box, a cold box, and in there's ice cream and honey and cottage cheese and all kinds of delicious things. Bears are smart, and they smell what's in there and they realize what's going on and that they can get a nice big hit of calories, which they like to do before they hibernate, by breaking into the house. And you would think that a bear-proof or bear-resistant garbage container would be a simple answer, and it does work when people use them right, which they often don't. Another problem in ski resort areas is a lot of these are vacation rentals, so people are coming in from the city, from out of town, and first of all, they maybe don't know what they're supposed to do or how to work the lock. It's sort of a two-step thing. It's a little tricky. And when bears start to spend a lot of time in close proximity to humans, there's going to eventually come a point where somebody's going to get hurt. Say the bear breaks in their home and their dog gets excited and the bear attacks the dog. The person tries to break it up. The bear turns on the person, and then the person gets hurt or killed, and then that bear is destroyed. Anytime bears start breaking into houses with regularity, they're considered a threat to public safety, and if trapped, are killed. So leaving the garbage unsecured or leaving the pet food out or whatever it is, you're basically sentencing that bear to eventually to be put down.
You wrote about bears in this book, elephants, leopards, seagulls, macaques, and you often do kind of up-close immersive reporting. Did any of the close-up work on this book unnerve you with these animals?
A couple of times I was nervous. One evening up in leopard country, and the backstory to this is I'd spent the entire morning as we were driving through to where we were staying. This is up in the middle Himalaya. There's mostly just little villages up there. And all along the way, the researcher who spends a lot of time up there working with people to try to advise them on how to stay safer, he would point out where the leopard attacks had happened. See that bus shelter? An old man sitting there alone, he was taken. See this field? This was an audacious attack. Many people were all out there in the middle of the day. A small girl was taken. Right here, where we're parking, in 2009, he had this whole catalog of people who had been killed by leopards. And at one point, I wanted to go out for a walk, and I kind of lost my way a bit. I'm walking down the road, but there are, the attacks tend to happen on the road. And dusk is the time most often when they happen. And I kind of ended up being out a little bit later than I thought and was walking back at dusk alone on the road going, "You're so stupid, Mary Roach." I was mugged by a macaque. I guess it was briefly terrifying.
It doesn't sound fun. The one last question, and it's also another question about the reporting and the writing on this book, because we're coming off a period, I don't know if we're even coming off it, of isolation and lockdown and pandemic. And so for a lot of writers, this was a year of writing about your living room, but you obviously were out there doing all this reporting. Did the pandemic put the kibosh on any of your intended work on this book?
Well, I was lucky in that I was almost done with the reporting by the time COVID hit. There was one story I was going to do in Montreal. It had to do, or maybe it was Toronto, had to do with raccoons. And I remember it was March and COVID was just getting rolling. And I remember talking to the United Airlines guy. He said, "Well, the border is shut." I said, "Oh, it'll be open by May, right? I could still meet my deadline. May would work, right?" Like I thought this would end in 2 months.
Ha 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 ha.
I know. So naive. That chapter didn't happen. I always wanted to go somewhere for a chapter, unless it's historical. That's my preferred way of operating. I enjoy it. I think it makes it more fun for the reader. So there was one chapter I had to add, and that had to be just done by phone. And that felt confining to me. It was also kind of a very quiet year because the book was approaching being done. So I did things like, I did a middle grade adaptation of Packing for Mars. It did things that didn't require going somewhere. It could have been so much worse. I don't know what I would have done had it happened a year earlier. I wouldn't have been able to go and report any of these things that are in the book.
Well, it's full of vicarious travel and animal encounters for future readers. Mary, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, Pamela. I always enjoy doing this podcast.
Mary Roach's latest book is called Fuzz, When Nature Breaks the Law. Liz Harris joins us now with some news in the publishing world. Hey, Liz.
Hi, Pamela. The big story in publishing at the moment is the big story all over the world, really, which is that the supply chain is a mess. There are essentially like two separate supply chains for books, and both of them at every step along the way has some kind of problem. For books printed with a lot of color, like picture books, those are mostly printed abroad, generally in Asia, and then you got to get them over here. But there aren't enough shipping containers to go around these days, and it's much more expensive than it usually is to get one. So that's the first problem. And when you finally get a container and get the books on a ship, there are serious delays at the American ports where these shipments usually go, in part because they, like everybody else, are having trouble finding enough workers. And then there are all these reports of all these huge ocean freighters just hanging out in the water waiting for their turn to dock. And when the boats finally do dock, you take the container and you put it on a set of wheels called a chassis so you can move it. Well, there aren't even enough chassis to go around either. And then there's the labor issue comes back because there aren't enough truck drivers to get the books to the warehouse or to the bookstores. And distribution centers and warehouses are also having trouble with staffing. And the pandemic, as we have all noticed, is still very much ongoing. So sometimes people get sick, and that causes its own disruptions and delays. And for books that are printed domestically, novels, things like that, they don't have to deal with the ocean freight issue, but all those other issues of transportation and staffing and COVID still apply. And then they have an additional problem of printer capacity because there is more demand for time at book printers in this country than there is room to actually do that printing. So perhaps where this is likely to be the biggest problem is with reprints. As book selling is an art, not a science, and publishers and retailers try to guess how popular a book might be. But every season there are books they print too many of and books where they print too few. And when they need to print more, usually this is not a big deal, takes a couple weeks, place the order, the books show up. But this season, it's going to be really tight at the printers. So you might have a book that's a surprise hit and reprints could take a lot longer, and they could wind up being out of stock for weeks and weeks right when that book is most in demand. So if you're the author of one of those books when that happens, to put it very scientifically, that really sucks.
All right. So there is inequality in publishing as there is inequality in all things. So I'm curious what this means for, let's say, a really big book like Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen's book coming on October 26th, or for Sally Rooney's most recent novel, which debuted at #1.
Publishers are doing their very best not to mess up any of their books, but their priority is obviously these big tentpole books. And so far, they move heaven and earth and try and make sure that they don't have to move publication dates for those books, or to really try and get them there on time. And so far, they have averted any disasters. I mean, if you move the publication date for like a little book, it's not great, but it's not the end of the world. But if you move Sally Rooney, you have all this publicity and all this marketing and so many huge orders at different retailers, and all of that gets thrown up in the air. So basically, they have tried everything possible to keep the big books on target. They know they're going to need a lot of those books. So the guesswork is somewhat less, like they're going to be really popular, order a ton of them.
So let's say you are not Barack Obama or Sally Rooney, and you have a book coming out, and you had a pub date, and you had a little virtual book tour around it, and maybe you were doing a few literary festivals and signing some copies, and your publisher says, guess what? We're not going to have your book. What does that mean?
Every account has to be renegotiated. So let's say you were lucky enough to like get into Target or something, which moves a ton of books. Maybe you were supposed to be in the fall and they would have you in stock for the holidays. But if you're not going to get there until early November, maybe it's not worth it for Target to buy so many, or maybe they're not going to buy them at all. So that kind of thing can happen, or indies can change the size of their orders. Maybe bookstores who had an event are like, oh no, well now we have too much the week that your book is coming out. So sorry, never mind. Those are the bad things that could happen. Or maybe you get lucky and the bookstores can work with you. But I mean, the festival's not going to change the festival date if you're supposed to be there and your book's not out yet. Maybe they don't have you. So it can really cause real problems.
Is there any solution?
No. So much of this has to do with COVID at its root, and people who know international shipping issues much better than I do are saying that in particular, that's going to take a long time to sort itself out. And I'm told the domestic market should get better more quickly than the international issues. But at the moment, the best people can do is publishers are trying to plan ahead. Retailers are trying to order early, though that presents its own challenges for little bookstores because they don't really have the cash or the space to place huge orders in advance. People are just sort of doing their best, and people have different strategies. I was talking to someone yesterday who was saying you might think that a publisher should just order big on everything, but actually they're ordering smaller and then saving some room for reprints for whatever the surprise reprint needs are. So people are just doing their best to manage, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. Whereas usually you place an order, the books arrive if you're a publisher, and now it takes 10 phone calls of where are they and when are they going to be there and all of that. So it just makes everyone's life much more complicated. But I guess we really just have to wait.
All right, one last question. Since everything has seemed to conspire against bookstores these past 2 years, particularly independent bookstores, but also chains, will not having these books, you think, weigh particularly hard on those outlets as opposed to online where you can just pre-order it or wait for it to get in?
Some bookstores are less nervous than I would have expected. Some of the big stores are sort of like, well, it's not like going to the grocery store where you go in for milk, and it's not like you can say, well, I'll buy this can of baby oil instead or whatever, and that will suffice. But at a bookstore, if you go in person and you're browsing, then maybe you're like, okay, well, they have this instead, and you go pick it up. So some think that there's actually some advantage to being in person. Whereas if you go online and you want to order a book and it's not there, you're like, well, they don't have it. And you're not really going to go browsing around because there isn't really the same browsing experience. So it's possible that in person will have some advantage on that one.
Well, I expect we'll hear more as things develop. Let's get those ships moving, Liz.
No problem.
All right. You're on it. Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela.
John Williams and Jen Szalai, our intrepid critics, join us now to talk about what they've been reading and reviewing lately. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
So, John, you did your Bob Woodward tour of duty this week.
I did. We all got the Boy Scout badge eventually as he keeps writing them. So the third book of Woodward's about the Trump presidency is recently out. It's called Peril. It follows the equally tersely titled Fear and Rage. And this one is co-written with his colleague at the Washington Post, Robert Costa. It covers the 2020 campaign season and Trump's last year in office and Biden's first few months in office. Like the other books, it's written in a fairly rat-a-tat-tat style. The chapters are short. It moves from scene to scene very abruptly. You're here and then you're there. And this one toggles back and forth between Trump and Biden's worlds. So it has that added wrinkle from the previous two books. But really the centerpiece of the book, it covers a ton of ground, but the real heart of it and where it takes its title from is the riot at the Capitol on January 6th and essentially Trump's behavior leading up to that and in the aftermath of that. And so it parses Trump's inability to admit that he lost the election in the couple of months after the election, and then the riot on January 6th. And then what comes across in the book as both dangerous and scary, but also somewhat comical attempts of lawyers and others to put together a convincing case that there had been widespread election fraud. And that part of the book obviously involves Trump's lawyers, including former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell and others who were much in the news at the time.
Can we rewind a moment and just do a light primer on recent Bob Woodward books? Because, Jen, you reviewed one, right? It started with Fear, which I very foolishly read on a beach in Greece. I did like the worst match between like venue and book. And then you reviewed the second one, Rage, Jen. Am I correct?
Yes. Rage. A lot of it covered the coronavirus pandemic. And that was sort of the big thing that people were talking about when the book came out, because Woodward had been interviewing Trump while he was writing Rage. And at the beginning of the pandemic, Trump had revealed to Woodward that he knew that it was terrible and deadly and dangerous. And meanwhile, he was telling the American public not to worry.
He told Woodward, I think, I like to downplay it. He said,
I like to downplay it, exactly.
Because I don't want people to be too scared.
Right, exactly. And so people were upset when Woodward's book came out because they felt like this was information that Woodward should have released at the time that he had it, that it would have been useful for the public to hear it coming from Bob Woodward, especially, who had a long career and a reputation as somebody who writes about American presidents and executive power.
John, you went back and read or reread Rage before you worked on this review, correct?
Yeah, and Fear, which I think I joked to you, I found almost a perversely good beach read. Not that I was on a beach at the time, but there is something about, I think Dwight, who reviewed the first book, said something about the fact that they're not contextual books. You're a fly on the wall. And they use these hundreds of sources that they talk to, but that they don't name. So that also doesn't clog up the pace. They do it all on deep background, as they say in journalism. So they're allowed to use what these people tell them, but they're not allowed to say who gave them which bits of information. And so there's a sense of them just recreating these scenes and putting you in the rooms with these people, sometimes a little bit more believably than others. And as I say in the review, they tend to give certain sources a softer light. And so you end up assuming that those people maybe cooperated with them a bit more and gave them more information. Because, for instance, in this book, William Barr, Trump's attorney general, is he's one of the few people who, a lot of people in the book disbelieve the election fraud scenarios. Lindsey Graham and other Trump supporters are telling him, look, the evidence just isn't there. But Barr in the book is one of the few people who gives him these long speeches, and really confronts him and tells him, look, your lawyers it's a clown car, and, they're just full of disinformation and they're lying to people. And he's presented in this pseudo-heroic light. And one imagines that he might have recreated some of these conversations for them.
Jen, hearing about this reminds me of when you talked about Tim Alberta's book, American Carnage, and that it's lots of people opening up, lots of sources opening up and saying all the terrible things that terrible people have said about other terrible people. It's just, I guess it doesn't sound like beach reading to me.
Yes, it's true. It doesn't sound like beach reading to me either. But Alberta, from what I remember of his book, were willing to go on the record to say stuff about the direction of the Republican Party under Trump, because he talked to a lot of people who felt publicly disaffected from the party. Whereas Woodward's book, yes, it's true that people clearly were leaking and revealing things to him, but because we don't know who said what John said about some people coming off much better in a more detailed way than others, I think is an interesting thing to think about, because you do realize probably these people were the ones who talked to Woodward. So their side of the story is the one that's really shaping the narrative.
See, if Alberta really wanted to get in on the title game, he would have just called it Carnage.
Right.
Yes, I feel like we should open up an online contest, or maybe this is Bob Woodward's job, like name Bob Woodward's next book. And probably end up with something like Bodie McBoatface, but I think it's worth a try. Although, John, he did have a co-author this time, and I'm curious if you sensed a shift in narrative voice or in reporting sourcing or style or anything.
I didn't really. I mean, I guess, maybe if you had a forensic lab, you could really get to the differences. Well, first of all, and I don't know who it always is, but I think that Woodward is very open about the fact that he obviously writes his books, but he has a lot of help. His wife helps him a great deal, who he always thanks. And he always has, a dedicated assistant who he makes it clear in these author notes that these people are more than the typical assistant, that he relies on people. And so I wonder if he's so used to that process that he assimilates other people's voices and work into his books in a very smooth way, because it didn't strike me as particularly different in tone or pacing from Fear or Rage. But it is interesting that as Woodward gets older, maybe I think someone online I saw conjectured that maybe he was preparing to pass the baton for this kind of work, which he must think is very important to chronicle these administrations one after the other, to possibly to someone like Costa.
Jen, you have a different charming subject for your the book you reviewed this week.
Yeah, so I reviewed The Contrarian by Max Chafkin, and it's a biography of Peter Thiel, who is the tech mogul who is known for various things. I guess probably the most prominent things is he's one of the co-founders of PayPal, and he was also a very prominent Trump supporter. And at the time when he came out in support of Trump, this was early on, and it was, I think, surprising for a lot of people, because Silicon Valley wasn't considered necessarily a bastion for Trump republicanism. And so Chafkin tells the story of Thiel's life, but he also uses it to tell a larger story of Silicon Valley, to look at its transformation from a place that was known for, a certain kind of utopianism, something that was almost maybe fanciful, but how it changed from that to really becoming a bastion of the kind of, I would say, ruthless libertarianism that's more affiliated with Peter Thiel. Thiel is really unsentimental, I think, when it comes to power. He makes no secret of that. And so The Contrarian uses his life story and his political support of Trump to show how that transformation took place.
All right, I have a substance question and then a technical question, which is, it's not really a technical question, but Thiel is, let's say, a litigious person.
Oh, right. I should mention that too. Yes.
And so in general, when one discusses him and his work, you sometimes tread lightly. And I'm curious, how does Chaikin approach his subject in the book? And did Thiel cooperate with this book?
I should also say, in addition to being known for PayPal, as well as his support for Trump, he is also known as somebody who bankrolled Hulk Hogan's lawsuit against Gawker. And that
this is like ancient internet history.
Right, I know. Although that was the lawsuit that really brought bankruptcy to Gawker, and it killed the website for a while. I mean, I think it's since been revived, but under different ownership, obviously, and leadership. So he's known for that. And so Chafkin, when he started reporting on the book, and he says this early, I think in his preface or introduction, a number of sources were willing to talk to him. A lot of them, though, didn't want to be named. So it was on background. And some of them, somebody asked him at one point, like, why are you doing this? Aren't you scared that he's going to come after you? The book really just takes the details of his life. I mean, there's nothing, I couldn't really think of anything in it that would necessarily strike me as the kind of thing that Thiel would object to at this point, because also, I mean, one of the things about the Gawker lawsuit, and Chafkin does talk about it a lot, is that Gawker for years was writing stuff about Thiel. Thiel is gay, and at the time, people in his circle knew that, but it wasn't necessarily something that was being written about in newspapers, but Gawker talked about it all the time. And so that's one of the things that Chafkin says that really made Thiel get on board with this idea that there might be a lawsuit that Hulk Hogan can bring. And the thing that Chafkin says, which I had never really thought about at the time, is that because Thiel considers himself a libertarian in favor of free speech, that he didn't want to bring a free speech lawsuit or anything that would hamper the idea of free speech. What he wanted to do, and obviously this sounds self-serving in many ways, I think, but what he wanted to do with the Hogan lawsuit was that it was an invasion of privacy lawsuit involving a video that was taken of Hogan. And so that became the thing that really brought Gawker to his knees, because the thing at the time, and people didn't know that Thiel was the one that was bankrolling this. And so there was lots of resources, and Hogan's legal team didn't want to settle because there was the opportunity to do that. So it became clear that there was some other dynamic at work. And so, the end result was the shuttering of this website.
Do you feel like this book answered all the questions you had about who Peter Thiel is and what motivates him and how does he operate?
So you asked earlier whether Thiel cooperated, and Chafkin has interviewed Thiel before. He didn't go on the record for this book. Thiel is known for being very secretive. I think it does do a good job of weaving together all these different points in his life. And so the whole idea of the title of The Contrarian is that Thiel was always taking measure of what the conventional wisdom was at the time and then positioning himself against it or questioning it. And so you do see him changing positions. You see how this works in terms of how he tries to make money, and it doesn't always work in his favor. I do feel like Chafkin, at least in terms of this moment, does as good a job as anybody could do, not only just telling the story of Thiel's life, but I really think that the connection to the larger story of Silicon Valley is really important. There is a little bit, at the end of it, Thiel does seem a bit of a cipher, but I don't think that that's Chafkin's fault. To a certain extent, if you're a contrarian, I think that there is that element of, well, what do you really believe?
Right.
You don't know until you know what they're going up against. Yeah.
There's no rosebud here.
Exactly. And so I felt like that was the end result that I came to at the book, which is, okay, so really, what does he believe? And I think that is still an open question. But again, I think that that's partly maybe because of who Thiel is.
All right, let's run down the books that you both reviewed. John?
I reviewed Peril by Bob Woodward and Robert Costa.
And I reviewed The Contrarian, Peter Thiel and Silicon Valley's Pursuit of Power by Max Chafkin.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.